The first rock cut through the evening mist like a bullet, shattering the lens of our primary camera. Before we could react, another sailed out of the murky depth of the forest, striking our generator with enough force to dent its casing. A third narrowly missed our heads and splintered against a tree behind us. And from a distance came a sound that turned my spine to ice. It began as a low whistle, bouncing among the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint its location, before rising to something that resembled human speech, but twisted, as if human words were being formed by an inhuman throat. As my team and I exchanged frantic glances, it was clear that the creature we'd been searching for months had found us. For centuries, and to those willing to peer beneath the surface of popular culture, encounters with the creatures called Sasquatch have always suggested something far beyond a simple undiscovered ape. Witnesses have described an extremely wide variety of interactions, with some being more consistent than others. Rocks and tree limbs hurled from great distances, complex vocalizations echoing through the forests, and most intriguingly, clear signs of coordinated behavior. Many witnesses also describe groups moving through dense forests, responding to calls that range from deep whoops to eerie, almost musical whistles. As it turns out, my investigation would reveal a species that has developed alongside us in near-perfect isolation. What follows is our complete analysis of the species, though what we found is not at all what any of us might have expected. For thousands of years before the term Bigfoot entered our lexicon, the indigenous peoples of North America maintained detailed knowledge of these beings. What distinguishes these historical accounts from mere folklore, my valued listener, is their remarkable consistency across linguistically unrelated tribes separated by vast distances. The Coast Salish peoples of British Columbia, from whom we derive the anglicized term Sasquatch, described beings that communicated through whistles and complex vocalizations, who threw rocks usually as territorial warnings rather than direct attacks, and who appeared to live in something like structured social groups. The Chehalis First Nation maintained detailed knowledge of these creatures' seasonal movements and habits, not as mythical entities, but as real beings sharing their forests. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their emphasis not on the creature's size, which would have been the obvious feature to exaggerate in pure mythology, but on their behavior. These accounts consistently describe calculated demonstrations of strength, wood-knocking signals that appeared to coordinate movements between multiple individuals, and most intriguingly, a deliberate relationship with human communities characterized by avoidance. Even as Western explorers pushed into the continent, accounts persisted. Theodore Roosevelt himself, in his 1893 book The Wilderness Hunter, related a disturbing account from a frontiersman named Bauman, who encountered what appeared to be a large bipedal creature that stalked his camp with apparent intelligence. Roosevelt, a trained naturalist and typically skeptical observer, included this account with unusual gravity. Of course, many dismiss these accounts as mistaken identity or outright hoaxes. I believe a healthy dose of skepticism is not only reasonable, but in the realm of science, necessary. And yet, if we allow ourselves to consider, even for a moment, that such a creature could exist, one can clearly see that there is a deeper thread binding all of these accounts. One of beings possessing a kind of intelligence that allows them to exist just at the periphery of human awareness. Not entirely hidden, but elusive enough to avoid true documentation. Unlike other predators that simply avoid humans out of instinct, these creatures seem, in a way, to understand us, in certain ways that suggest something beyond animal cognition. This long history of recorded encounters ultimately led my team to the eastern Sierra Nevada, where an unusual cluster of sightings had occurred over several years. Unlike many so-called Bigfoot reports that involve brief glimpses or singular events, these incidents involved behaviors and complex vocalizations described as unnatural. But in fact, the timing of our investigation was no coincidence. Just a few months prior, two men by the names of Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin captured their now infamous footage of what appeared to be a large bipedal primate walking along Bluff Creek in Northern California. While public reaction ranged from fascination to dismissal, our preliminary analysis of the film's subject, its distinctive gait, proportions, and fluid movement, suggested something that couldn't be easily classified as either hoax or known species. And so it was that we established a research station at an undisclosed location roughly 8 miles from the nearest access road, at approximately 8,500 feet elevation. As I unpacked our equipment, the most advanced technology science had available at the time, a feeling came over me that I simply couldn't shake. In the fading light, our lamps cast out a pale glow, but I sensed that in the darkness of that forest, just beyond the light's edge, this ancient wilderness was aware of our presence. Little did I know then how correct that intuition would prove to be, nor how profoundly what we would discover would challenge everything I thought I understood about natural history. I don't know if you've noticed, but these days, AI content seems to be taking over the world. It's getting harder and harder to find something created with real passion, effort, and artistry. That's exactly why I'm very happy to say that today's video is brought to you by A Widescreen Tale, an independent web series with a silly sci-fi fantasy narrative and a fantastic, ever-changing art style. The show takes place in a world populated by handcrafted puppet creatures, each with their own unique biology and lore, and some pretty wild designs. This, for instance, is the bookworm, a tiny creature that looks like folded paper, lives in old libraries, and survives by eating words with a preference for red ink. Or you may run across a frock, which looks like a rock until it opens its mouth. There are quite a few more, so many in fact that they're currently working on building a bestiary. Overall, the series is a stunning mix of media. There's Henson-style puppetry with gorgeous miniature work, live action, and even traditional 2D animation. And because they feature guest artists every episode, each episode has distinct visuals that complement the story. The whole thing has a fun, almost nostalgic feel, and when I watched the first episode, it genuinely brought a smile to my face. This is exactly the kind of project we need more of, creative, heartfelt, and made by a small group of real people. They're currently running a Kickstarter to fund their next few episodes or more, so if you like their style as much as I did and want to support independent creators like this, be sure to visit the link in the description. And now, back to the video. 6 weeks into our expedition, our accumulated evidence had become unmistakable, yet frustratingly incomplete. Our motion sensors had frequently been triggered in what appeared to be systematic patterns that didn't align with the random movement of wildlife. In fact, it frequently appeared that equipment had been manipulated. Not damaged, but deliberately turned away from our intended zones of observation. Food supplies, particularly high-calorie items, had gone missing despite being stored in bear-proof containers. It became clear that something in these woods was aware of us, was studying us, and perhaps even testing us. I found myself waking at night with the distinct sensation of being watched. Several of those nights I looked out the opening of my temporary dwelling to see what I thought were distant shadows moving between the trees. My colleagues reported similar experiences. Marcus claimed to have heard methodical tapping sounds against the station's outer walls, while Allison swore she'd glimpsed a massive silhouette observing us from a ridge nearly half a mile away. Then came the evening I described in my opening notes. For 3 days following that incident, it seemed that a tense silence had fallen over the forest. The normal sound of birds and small mammals seemed muted, as though, if you'll forgive the unscientific tone, the entire ecosystem were holding its breath. Then, while following a game trail that showed unusual patterns of disturbance, we made our most significant discovery. As we approached the base of a natural escarpment, a distinctive, musky odor guided us to a large, dark form partially obscured by fallen rocks. My initial thought was that we had found a bear carcass, but as we cleared away the vegetation, it quickly became clear that this was no bear. the body appeared to have fallen from a considerable height, perhaps during nocturnal movement along the nearby cliff face. Though partially scavenged by forest predators, the remains were substantial enough to allow for detailed examination. My team and I stood in stunned silence. By nearly complete chance, we were looking at something that should not exist. A creature that, now, had emerged from the shadows of legend and into stark reality. Here, at last, was the physical evidence that had eluded researchers for decades. A specimen that could be scientifically documented, measured, and analyzed beyond the limitations of casts of footprints and blurry photographs. What follows represents the first comprehensive analysis of Sasquatch physiology ever documented, compiled from our initial examinations and subsequent laboratory studies. Upon examination, the immediate and most obvious impression was the creature's remarkable size. At just over 8 foot 1 inch in height and 437 pounds, even its proportions alone would distinguish it from any known primate. The torso exhibited a more human-like narrowing at the waist, while the shoulders were proportionally broader than those of great apes, creating a silhouette that seemed to echo our own, though almost distorted through some biological funhouse mirror. The body was covered in hair averaging 3 to 4 inches in length, with significantly shorter coverage on the face, palms, and soles. Under the microscope, I found specialized adaptations for thermal regulation, including a distinctive inner layer of finer, more densely packed fibers. The coloration pattern varied by region, predominantly dark brown to black across the body, with subtle reddish tints along the shoulders and upper back. The intermembral index measured 82.6, placing it between human and gorilla proportions. The femur exhibited an unusual lateral curvature I've not seen in any extant primate, and was combined with reinforced cortical bone approximately 30% thicker than seen in humans relative to overall size. Interestingly, the vertebral column exhibited 26 presacral vertebrae rather than the standard 24 of humans, with specialized transverse processes that appeared specifically adapted to anchor hypertrophied spinal musculature. And close examination of the scapulae showed an elongated superior angle, which provided additional surface area for the attachment of powerful trapezius and rhomboid muscles. This is an adaptation which would provide extraordinary strength when pulling or climbing. Finally, there was the creature's dentition, clearly consistent with an omnivorous diet high in fibrous plant material. Premolars showed a tendency toward molarization, with broad occlusal surfaces, while the canines, somewhat reduced compared to great apes, remained more prominent than in modern humans. Beyond the skeletal features, a number of adaptations were evident in the specimen's other internal systems. For example, blood analysis revealed a concentration of hemoglobin some 24% higher than in humans, and what appeared to be specialized erythrocyte structures quite reminiscent of those seen in certain high-altitude mammals. These adaptations undoubtedly facilitate oxygen transport in mountainous regions, while simultaneously enhancing heat exchange capacity in the extremities. Additionally, and in support of the observations made of the dentition, the digestive system showed clear omnivorous adaptations. The cecum was approximately twice the size relative to body mass as that which is found in humans, likely to provide enhanced capacity for fermenting that fibrous plant material. And indeed, upon dissection, stomach contents included a mixture of plant fibers, berry seeds, and what appeared to be the remains of partially digested small mammals. All of this leads me to believe that this species is likely opportunistic in its feeding strategy. But perhaps most impressive were certain aspects of the creature's metabolism. Tissue samples indicated certain mitochondrial structures and dense deposits of brown adipose tissue, concentrated primarily around the neck, upper back, and intercostal regions. I hypothesize that in this species, these adaptations allow for significant energy conservation during periods of resource scarcity without requiring true hibernation, a kind of seasonal middle path between the constant high metabolism of humans and the torpor exhibited by certain other mammals. But what struck all of us was, to put it simply, the creature's face. Its features combined distinctly non-human characteristics: a pronounced supraorbital ridge, minimal nasal projection, and prognathic jaw, with unexpectedly human-like elements. A clearly defined chin, relatively thin lips, and facial musculature clearly capable of complex expressions. The eyes, though larger than human proportions, showed distinctive scleral differentiation typically absent in non-human primates. When I gently opened one eyelid during my examination, I found myself staring into a retina with a tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer that causes eyeshine in nocturnal animals, yet structured more like our own than any ape's. I cannot fully articulate the sensation of looking into that eye even in death. There was an intelligence there, somehow preserved in its final gaze. In short, this creature's appearance resided in that most unsettling region of recognition, too human to be dismissed as merely an animal, yet too alien to be accepted as one of our own. And then, of course, there was the creature's most bizarre feature. It was during our initial documentation of external morphology that Allison made an observation so basic, we couldn't believe that we'd missed it till that point. While the feet of the specimen displayed the 5 digits consistent with long-established track evidence, each hand possessed a standard arrangement of 4 fingers plus the normal semi-opposable thumb, but with an additional 6th digit positioned on the ulnar side, adjacent to the 5th finger. At first, I thought that perhaps this was a case of polydactyly resulting from a genetic anomaly, a phenomenon wherein the extra digits often lack full functionality or skeletal integration. But in this case, the supplementary digit possessed its own dedicated musculature, neurological connections, and complete bone structure. Indeed, the 6th digit showed independent mobility and appeared to work in coordination with the other fingers, and this was confirmed in the following day's X-ray analysis. These additional digits were supported by corresponding metacarpal structures completely integrated into the architecture of the hand. From the perspective of developmental biology, this trait certainly presents a challenge. The pentadactyl limb, with which we as humans are quite familiar, has remained remarkably conserved across virtually all record, with the only notable exceptions involving reduction rather than addition of digits. In short, though more study will be necessary to determine conclusively, it would seem that the precision with which these extra digits were positioned, their complete functional integration, and their bilateral symmetry all suggest that this trait was a stable characteristic of the population. What makes this finding even more bizarre is the asymmetry between the 5-toed feet and the 6-fingered hands, as of course, developmental pathways typically affect both forelimbs and hind limbs similarly. And yet, this is not unlike a pattern I've seen before, though only once, in certain remains we recovered in the North American Southwest, though these beings were of a much greater stature. At this time, my valued listener, I have no qualm in admitting that we do not understand the biological reason for this extra digit. At least, not yet. At this point, we move to the cranial structure, the capacity of which measured approximately 1,400 cubic centimeters. This falls within the range of modern humans, but significantly exceeds that of even the largest great apes. This alone indicates cognitive capabilities beyond what we would normally associate with non-human primates. Externally, the most obvious feature of the skull was an enlarged sagittal crest, similar to gorillas, which later dissection would reveal serves as an anchor point for the powerful jaw muscles. However, unlike typical non-human primates, the skull also exhibited a more vertical forehead reminiscent of our own species. This combination of features created a distinctive profile that, frankly, adds to its uncanny appearance. Moving inward, I noted that the frontal lobes, associated with planning and complex social behavior, were highly developed, as were the temporal regions typically associated with auditory processing. But of all the brain structure, the most fascinating aspect was a clearly expanded arcuate fasciculus, a neural pathway critical in humans for language processing. At the time, we had little idea what need these creatures would have for such developed language centers. We would soon find out, but we'll return to that shortly. The level of specialization so far described extended to the sensory systems. The eyes, as I've mentioned, appeared well adapted to low-light conditions, with approximately 30% more rod cell density than in humans, coupled with the reflective tapetum lucidum for enhanced vision even in near darkness. The nasal cavity contained an expanded olfactory epithelium with approximately 3 times the surface area found in humans, as well as an enlarged olfactory bulb in the brain. This adaptation would of course enable detection of specific individuals at considerable distances, as well as the identification of food sources invisible to our comparatively limited sense of smell. Overall, it is clear that this creature is ideally suited to its environmental niche, capable of operating effectively in darkness and of detecting potential threats or prey at significant distances. In this regard, it's little wonder how this species has managed to likely intentionally evade scientific observation for so long. And yet, for one brief moment in the wilderness of the Sierra Nevada, The boundary between observer and observed collapsed. I return now to that night in the forest. The sound that froze my spine began as a low whistle bouncing among the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint its location. But as the whistle transformed, rising in pitch before breaking into a pattern that resembled speech, I realized it wasn't merely the unsettling quality of the sound that disturbed me, though that was certainly an aspect of it. More than that, it was the vocalization's structure. What we recorded that night and subsequently analyzed did not indicate random animal calls, but sophisticated acoustic articulation with distinct patterns. In fact, spectrographic analysis identified at least 37 distinct sound units combined in sequences that displayed consistent internal organization. And then the patterns changed when a second, more distant voice joined the first. Their exchange took on what appeared to be turn-taking, a fundamental feature of conversational structure. Beyond these vocalizations, we documented an extensive system of percussive communication, patterns of wood and rock knocking that carried for remarkable distances through the forests. What became increasingly clear was that the rock-throwing incident described in my opening notes was a display not of random aggression, but a coordinated response. In retrospect, it seems, as previously mentioned, that the projectiles were aimed with remarkable precision at our recording equipment rather than team members, and preceded by vocalizations that likely served to coordinate the positions of multiple individuals we never saw. After weeks spent in those forests, in some ways, I found myself changed. The forest outside was not simply some detached ecosystem to be cataloged. It had become a living, almost breathing entity. And the further I looked into it, the more I felt as though it was looking back. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of my movements, speaking more softly, glancing over my shoulder with increasing frequency. Once, I caught my own reflection in a case of field equipment, and I was startled by the haunted quality I saw in my own eyes. The track patterns we documented revealed something I wasn't fully prepared to confront. These beings had established a surveillance perimeter around our camp, approaching at night to study our equipment, our supplies, and our behaviors. These footprints sometimes stopped mere yards from where I slept, as if they had stood silently watching, and we oblivious to their presence. The psychological weight of this realization is difficult to convey. To comprehend that while we have only recently confirmed these creatures' existence, they have likely been studying us for generations, perhaps learning our patterns, our weaknesses. Well, it is a disturbing thought to anyone who thought they understood their place in the natural order. I often wonder what they make of us, these watchers from the forest edge. Do they see us as a threat to be monitored, a curiosity to be studied, or perhaps as something more complex, beings with whom they share an ancient and largely forgotten history? In the course of a normal investigation, I often seek to categorize a specimen according to conventional taxonomy, at least as much as is possible. But because our Sasquatch specimen exhibited such a variety of traits, the challenge of doing so is notable. For example, its brain structure, bipedal adaptation, and behavioral complexity would seem to indicate a relationship to the hominin lineage, yet multiple other physiological and morphological features diverge significantly. After extensive comparative analysis with existing fossil records, I've come to a tentative conclusion that these beings may represent a previously unknown branch of the Paranthropus lineage. a genus of robust Australopithecines typically thought to have gone extinct approximately 1.2 million years ago. There are several anatomical features that support this hypothesis. The cranial structure, with its pronounced sagittal crest and robust mandible, bears great similarities to Paranthropus robustus and Paranthropus boisei, though scaled to much larger proportions. Additionally, as we've previously described, the dental morphology in this species likely lends itself to a diet that includes significant amounts of fibrous plant material, which is consistent with what we know of Paranthropus species. Of course, the implications of such a lineage surviving to the present day is highly unlikely, but not impossible. Indeed, this branch of hominins could have migrated to North America during the Pleistocene, possibly crossing the Bering Land Bridge alongside early Homo populations. This could certainly explain the variety of primitive and derived features we observed in our specimen. The Paranthropus lineage was already adapted for robust physical strength and processing tough vegetation, adaptations that would serve well in the diverse North American wilderness. Over time, isolated populations could have developed the specialized sensory and cognitive adaptations we've documented in response to their unique ecological niche. But then there is the six-fingered trait, which represents the greatest challenge to this hypothesis. It goes without saying that no known Paranthropus fossils exhibit such a feature, and as previously noted, the addition of digits is a significant deviation from the mammalian pattern. Perhaps this trait arose as a rare genetic mutation that proved advantageous for tool manipulation and was subsequently fixed in the population, though I must admit I find this explanation unsatisfying. In any case, based on our findings, I estimate the North American population likely ranges between 2,000 to 4,000 individuals, distributed primarily in the mountainous regions of the Pacific Northwest, with smaller subpopulations throughout the Appalachian Range and isolated pockets in other wilderness areas. Low population density, combined with their extensive territories and sophisticated avoidance behaviors, could explain why definitive scientific documentation has remained elusive despite centuries of reported encounters. What became of our specimen is a matter I hesitate to discuss in detail. Following our field analysis, we were instructed to transport the body to a company facility that was not on any documentation I had previously been provided. Upon arrival, the specimen was immediately transferred to a separate team, and despite my repeated inquiries, I was never granted access to it again. The forest where we conducted our research was subsequently designated as a restricted zone by the Department of the Interior, ostensibly for ecological preservation. I don't know whether I will be granted opportunity to study these creatures further, nor whether their existence will ever emerge into public awareness. I certainly have my doubts as to both. For now, I can only suggest that if you find yourself in the deep wilderness and sense that disturbing feeling of being watched, well, you very likely are. This video was made possible by viewers like you. An extended version of this video is available to channel members and Patreon subscribers. You can check it out via a link in the description. Thanks for watching, and remember, you matter.